Our very special guest today is Andrew Stotter-Brooks, known as Stotts to his friends and colleagues. We've got to know Andrew and his work at close quarters in recent years and have grown to admire a truly unique approach to people and organisational development. Andrew is a reflective practitioner, very down to earth, very thoughtful about his work and his purpose, and very energetic in applying this. So it's not a surprise that in October 2022, he was nominated as number one in a list of 10 most influential HR leaders in the United Arab Emirates. Andrew has a special interest in leadership, which we will explore, and usefully has picked up on our work on mental toughness and incorporated this into his thinking and his work. You've often spoken about leadership. I think you've got some fascinating views on leadership. Why have you got this interest in leadership?
I suppose for me, it's just about trying to help people. It's just trying to help people just be the best that they can possibly be. It's probably the simplest way of putting it. It's really, really interesting. I was listening to a podcast actually by the Harvard Business Review at the weekend, and the whole piece around being kind. One of my great heroes is a guy called Elton Mayo, and he obviously was very sort of like early in the discovering of what we call sort of emotional quotient, EI or EQ. And I suppose the really big kind of piece that I took away, definitely early part of my career, was the importance of keeping it human, keeping it kind, really caring about people. I think if we do that, it's just incredible the impact that has. Our numbers speak for themselves. I mean, the idea that we're now such an incredibly profitable organization because we're creating this sense of alignment, this sense of care, this real kind of like kindness, and helping people to be the best they possibly can be, and help people, I suppose, play to their strengths. I think that's important as well. So the idea that we can put people in the right places and let them really kind of enjoy their work is really critical. So yeah, so I suppose in one word, just being kind.
Allowing people to, or enabling and supporting people to be the best they can be sounds fantastic. So if I'm listening to that, I'm then thinking, okay, like, how do you do that?
I think it's giving them a voice. I think the more that we ask questions and the more that we encourage them to feel comfortable asking questions and to challenge and to really be innovative. I think sometimes I think as leaders it's a bit of a curse, isn't it? We have this experience ourselves, and we sometimes forget that as leaders we've made mistakes in the past. One of my favorite topics when I'm talking to leaders is that whole point around failing. I think sometimes when we don't want our team to fail. We don't want our team to hurt themselves, but we also forget that when they are failing, they are learning as well. And so sometimes by just allowing them the space to have that experience and actually to perhaps get it wrong and to learn from that experience is really important. It takes slightly longer. It's the easiest thing in the world for me to tell someone how to do something. But the reality is when we tell someone how to do something, there isn't really much learning going on. And it's really about allowing them to do things their way, and it's about allowing humans to do things their own way, allowing employees to do things their way, even if we're not necessarily comfortable with that. I have a duty of care towards my children. I have a duty of care towards my guests, my business, and to my employees. But sometimes I don't know best, and I think it's a very, very interesting conversation, just allowing them to have a go and to practice and perhaps make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. So yes, and letting them feel comfortable asking questions. There's a chap called Alan Layton. He was the chairman of Asda and Walmart, a very early part of my career, and he always spoke about these kind of like these. Maybe I'm sort of putting people in boxes, but I don't really want to. That's not really my intention here. But he would always say there's three types of individual starts, and when we're trying to do something, there's obviously what we call our embracers, and these people kind of really kind of they just love it. They just rat down a drain pipe, which is fantastic. There's also this huge sort of body of people, probably 65-70% of people, who tend to just think that change is being done to them, and they can't really do anything about it. They can't really challenge it. And then we have probably the smaller group who are the kind of the sort of the verbal kind of rejectors of everything. So really and I think classically what managers tend to do, what leaders tend to do, is almost ostracize the rejectors, because we feel that they're disruptive and they're not really helping us from a leadership perspective, and they're getting in the way, and they're just difficult human beings. But my experience, and definitely what Alan taught me many years ago, was just actually, let's listen to these people, because sometimes they're they're able to verbalize what the majority are thinking. So actually just allowing people to have a voice and to kind of like raise their concerns, rightly or wrongly, it gives you some clarity, seeing things from different perspectives. So yeah, the more that you can do that, and the more that you can have forums and you can listen to people and you can get people involved in projects. I suppose a big part of my job is making sure that critically everyone is aligned to delivering those goals for the organization, but then the specific actions that they're taking to do that deliver that goal for the organization, and actually then how we develop the skills to help them to be successful delivering those goals for the organization, because that's where it's really at. So that complete alignment of what we're trying to do.
Do you know what I really like about that, Stotts, is that you gave some specific examples there, but at the start you kind of went straight to look. It starts by that kind of perspective that you mentioned, duty of care. You kind of made this inference that it's similar to sort of looking after your own children and stuff. And I think it's really interesting that before you get into what you do and how you do it, that sort of overarching philosophy of caring for people and being kind sort of has to sit front and centered.
I'm turning into an old man, John, and I've had team members from literally not making this up, but 40 years ago, who have kind of reached out to me and they remember me. And it's really, really, I just find that staggering. And I say, I've told the story to a few people now, and they say, well, why are you surprised that they remember you after 40 years? And they remember me and they want to then sort of reach out and say, well, you just touched me, Andrew. When you worked with me when I was, when you were a young man as a manager in your sort of early 20s. And you actually, I have very, very, you really touched me. And you touched me because you were very caring, you were very kind, you were supportive, you were asking questions, you really kind of helped me in my career. And that was really fascinating for me. I was chatting to our head of comms about this kind of phenomenon. What was interesting when she then kind of like, made a very interesting comment to me, and that was people never forget how you make them feel. That sense where people need to be heard, they need to be respected, remembered, acknowledged. And it's so very simple. If you do those things with people, it makes a huge difference. People do not care what you know until they know how much you care. It's a small investment. It's just the simplest things like saying good morning and saying things like, what else do you need from me? It makes a big difference. And unfortunately, there's no quick way of doing that. You have to. One of the things that Tony said to me recently was, I'm completely staggered, Andrew, that so many people know who you are within the organisation. How have you achieved that in your time with Etihad? And I said, Tony, honestly, if you want, and we did this on a podcast and with Tony, and I was interviewing him a few weeks ago, and I said, well, honestly, Tony, it's because I say good morning and good evening and I smile and I wave to people in the office every day. Yeah, not just when I'm feeling in a good mood, every day. And that gets the relationship going, really. Yeah.
Andrew, where did you learn that from? Because we could talk to another person who wouldn't we talk these stories, wouldn't emphasise the power of kindness and care as much as you do.
So I think that's almost been some learning for me, because I want to be the leader that I would follow. I think that's really, 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 really important. Yeah. And probably the most important lesson I ever learned was on my second day of employment in my career, which was, and anyone who's listening to this would know the answer to this question, but if you're a waiter, there's a very interesting dynamic that kind of goes on. And I can always, I'm very privileged, I go out for dinner quite a lot, and I go to some very nice restaurants, but it always staggers me the level of service that you do or don't get. And because actually there's a very, very real transaction between the level of service you receive and the amount of money you're prepared to give the server, right? It's called a gratuity or a tip, right? So if I actually kind of learned very quickly that when I was earning only £4 a week, we're talking, it's a long time ago, right? So I was earning £4 a week to be a waiter, but I could easily clear £100 a week in gratuities.
Wow.
Yeah. So because what I was able to do, and I'm not making it up, what I was able to do is actually give people what they need. And when people ask me that question, I will say to them that, quite honestly, if you give people what they need, you can pretty much write your own check It doesn't matter if you're talking to the CEO, the chairman, the general manager, the director. Give them what they need. Understand what they need, and then you basically give it to them. That's a big secret.
I can imagine leadership being about helping people with challenges. And for a lot of people, facing a challenge introduces a sense of fear because it's unknown. But I would say helping somebody to stretch themselves is a key aspect of leadership. Our guest today is Rebecca Herbert, known as Bex to her friends and colleagues. She's actually a very special guest. Bex is somebody who is both thoughtful and very observant. She's also very open to new ideas, mainly because she's always looking for solutions that work better than the solutions we already have. And it is this approach that is so interesting and valuable. With many of our guests, we can usefully explore what they do. With Bex, we explore why she chooses what she does and how this often requires a degree of courage to be that little bit different.
I come from America, so I'm an immigrant, and then tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with an English literature degree. So my first proper grown-up job was working in schools. So I did go into education, but I ended up kind of going in through like multi-agency support teams and working with young people who were in that sort of NEET category, so not in education, employment, or training. And I dealt with young people who had really, really poor attendance. So in a secondary school in Leeds. And I mean, some of my people in my books had over the 3 years of high school, 20% attendance. So that really, really not engaged with school. And so that's like my the first time where I was like, where does the system not serve people? So these kind of young people were being put into these boxes of like, you're just not doing what you're supposed to do. But having met them and met their families, I was thinking, I just think the system's messed up. Like, I don't think it's these kids. I think there's something that the system needs to adjust and change in order to cater for what those young people were going through. So to give an example, a lot of the kids that we're dealing with were also young carers. So they were having to make choices as to whether they would go to school and invest in their education or whether they would care for their ailing parents. So started to work with my colleagues across the education system. We came up with something called the halfway house, and we just made a new system for them. We will create an education system that allows the school to get their tick box. So literally, I would kind of pick them up, let them step into the school, give them their tick around education, and then we created a whole learning package that was essentially what we would have done during COVID. It was just done remotely. We just adapted it to their circumstances. I just think that that first step into that space was this sort of rebelliousness around me in terms of sometimes the system is not set up for the people that work within it. So I'm really interested in those people who thrive in spite of conditions. And my kind of mission in terms of all the places I then went on to do was, where can we design a system? Where do we recognize where the system serves a majority, but actually how can we start to cater for the people who fall outside of those areas? So that's why I really like organization design and development, because you start to look at not people as a problem, but the system conditions, and then start to understand when applied in different ways. It's really interesting. And I think education is a good example where you have people who flourish and thrive in spite of system conditions. They get that stuff done in spite of poor leadership, poor funding, not having access to things. And I see that again and again in so many kind of public organizations. And I think there's just a certain quality, isn't there, in terms of people who just get that sort of tenacity, and they believe so strongly in the outcomes that they're aiming for, that in spite of all the things that we put in their way, they still plow through. So from an OD perspective, I think the best thing I can do is just get rid of the barriers that get in the way. So I quite like to think of myself as like, I use an American phrase, like a defensive linebacker. And I'm just defense, just clear the line to make way so that people can just do their best work. Before we started the recording, we were talking a bit about politics. And I think there's something that I've learned through my work, which is kind of navigating power, and helping people kind of demystify that, because sometimes we have assumptions about who holds the power. And when you start to shift that and give people a little bit of like the rules of the game, and I'm thinking maybe a bit of Eric Byrne here, that sort of games people play. But once people know some of the rules of engagement and know how to play the games, you can have better outcomes. And it's not about being manipulative or insincere in your methods, but just knowing how to navigate some of those paths and redistributing some of that power, I find is a really helpful way of working with those people who have belief, who have comms, but maybe have been boxed in or hemmed in or not believed in, or again, labeled as difficult, obstinate, because that type of thinking, and often what I find with this group of people, some of their commonalities, is they're often the ones who are really good at doing those sort of pre-mortem, red teaming, how can we break this? So when they're offering views about this isn't going to work, they're not trying to derail the project, but they're trying to help you think more broadly about the ways things could fail. And if you embrace that and use that as like a skill set, rather than boxing them out of the room because they're not being nice about your idea, I find you can get you get great buy-in. You've thought about the mitigation. They'll think through things that you would never even dream about, the doomsday scenario. And that project or that piece of thing that you're doing will work so much better.
You mentioned tenacity earlier. That I suppose in our model we talk about sort of commitment and things like that. The pugnacious, just keep going forward, and they have that sense of I understand exactly what I'm able to do, and I know what I can't change right now, so don't worry about it, keep going. And you can kind of contrast that in some ways with people who have very different characteristics. But I love that kind of blend of different types of characters that essentially, I suppose, once you start putting them together in teams, you should get some form of success.
We often talk about diversity, don't we? And how important it is to have diverse teams. But I find myself more often talking about it's diversity of thought. It's not just about where you come from, but it's how you think and how you approach things and how you present things, and having the kind of the awareness of the areas and the strengths that you bring in a group setting, but also being really kind of overt about, I'm not quite good at this, and inviting people to kind of fill those gaps for you is a really, you start to get this stronger, we can't do all of the thinking in our minds, and when you start to kind of externalize it and kind of plug into this group mind, as long as you have the diversity of thought in the room, that can be really excellent. Done poorly, though, when you haven't put together and crafted a team that's diverse thought, you just get groupthink. So you're just confirming your own biases and your own assumptions, and nobody is really building or challenging that thinking. And that's quite a stifling experience, I think. So there's the right treatment, but there's something about that difference is necessary in that sort of, in those spaces, in order to make things move. Otherwise, it just becomes this sort of revolving wheel that doesn't let off any sparks, does it?
Now, to me, politicians, especially if you have a portfolio, it's normally in an area that you don't necessarily have expertise, but you hopefully rely on experts. Are the strongest characters the ones who are kind of able to be a bit more vulnerable in that sense and sort of recognize, well, do you know what, here's the stuff that I maybe not so good at and other people know a bit more than me? Does that take an element of strength to be able to do that? Because you kind of veering away from, I suppose, looking like someone who knows everything.
So if I bring that just into leadership more broadly, I think that's absolutely a feature. And when I if I think from my own experience of working with the people I loved working with and the people I loathed working with, the different.
I thought you were going to say less loved, but no.
No, I was going to. I'm not even gonna mince words there. Load the door. Where I think that defining quality was that vulnerability in terms of an awareness of when to ask for help, of when to know things, like where their ego didn't get in the way of saying, I don't know the answer to this, but we can find out. And I was thinking, again, I love the idea of trust and thinking about trust and leadership and those sorts of spaces. And when I think about some of those ingredients, there's something around the vulnerability to say, I know something, I don't know something. I think it's harder to say I don't know something. What an act of bravery to stand up and not know the answers in front of somebody. And then create an invitation for other smart people to find the answers. I like to think of leadership as not knowing the answers, but knowing who you can trust to find the answers, or creating the space for people to do that. And that's particularly relevant where innovation is a feature of the work. So if we already knew the answer, then you wouldn't need to innovate, and then you would just be doing the same thing. And yet we know nothing remains static. You're never standing in the same part of the river. So there has to be that ability to move and recognize that creating the conditions for people to do that thinking, that things are always moving, kind of requires you to go, and I don't know the answers, because you need to kind of create that excitement of, oh, I might know the answer. But if you're always modeling being a know-it-all, like how unachievable is that? I was supporting the reform agenda, which was looking across the whole civil service and trying to think, how can we be a better civil service? And there are some real strengths to the program. But there was one particular thing that I think was frustrating, and which I would say was not being able to finish the sentence. So the program had sort of three main parts in terms of how it was going to do a thing. But the thing that was missing, and this is not just the Cabinet Office, but I'm talking just programs in general, the thing that tends to be missing is finish your sentence in pursuit of what? So when you have a really large organization or even a small organization and you want people to do a thing, you don't tell them how to do that. It's not, here is your step-by-step step of how to get there. But if you haven't articulated the destination and allowed them some space to think about what is the best way to get to that destination, if you haven't finished your sentence, then telling people to do step A, B, and C is just doing step A, B, and C. It doesn't add up into anything. And I think sometimes in large programs or and maybe just speaking across, I'm not sure if I'm qualified to speak across, all government, UK society in general, but if you don't finish your sentence and sort of say, what are we about? You can't just run sort of a change program where everybody's going to be a machine that just does what they're told. They have to have some of that creativity to go off piste and find new ways of kind of getting to that outcome. So you have to articulate the outcome. And I think that's often missing. It feels a bit of a feature of this current decade of the life that I'm living right now, that I'm not sure what we're pursuing. What is the thing that we should care about? Because if we haven't finished the sentence, are we going to be the world leaders in sustainable energy? Do we want to eradicate poverty? But there's something around caring about everything, which means you can then care about nothing. So
we're leveling up, Bex. We're leveling up. Don't ask what it means.
You're leveling up.
No one knows what it means.
Redistributing, and again, that's another one of those areas where it's like the method happened before the purpose. And I guess I'm quoting Vanguard method, but purpose measures method is, what the Vanguard method tells us. But we're talking method first. So we're going to level up. So we're going to start to move the jobs out of London and put them in different places. So that's a method in pursuit of what? What is the outcome, and how do people get there? This is where we want to get to. I'm going to trust you to go freewheel it and figure out how we're going to get there.
I think that sense of trust in leadership, one of the things that strikes me, so I work in sport, and one of the challenging things I always find for being a team manager or a head coach or something is such a difficult job, because you can't go on the pitch and kick the ball around or anything like that. You entirely trust everybody else. So you give away all of the responsibility, but you maintain all of the accountability. Like, it's such a difficult thing to do. And I always see one of the challenges that they have there is when the person in charge, because they're maintaining that accountability, it's hard to separate and just give the actual responsibility for doing the stuff to people. So they're sort of trying to micromanage them and stay on top of them and tell them what to do. And it really does take a lot of, I think, ability to be able to sort of, I suppose, part of the ego. But I think to get there, it's knowing that, and whatever happens, I believe that I've got the capacity in me to sort of, we'll solve it. Like, we'll go forward into something that some stuff might go wrong and I might not feel that it was my fault, but I do believe I'm good enough to be able to, pick up the pieces and try and sort it out and embrace that sort of uncertainty.
For sure. And you kind of make me think about like what the different hats are that you play as a leader and as a manager in that space. So there's something about like the coaching aspect of that. So obviously your players on the field or your people in your team, your job in kind of managing them is not to do their job for them, but to really give them the best feedback, the best opportunity to get as good as they can at that part of their job so that they can perform it really well. And doing it for them isn't the way in which you get them to build up that skill and that capability. And there's a real, I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding about how important that kind of manager role is. We talk often about everybody should be a leader, and yeah, it's great. But I think for me, leaders often are setting direction, creating energy. I will make a distinction. And I work with a colleague called Tony Nichols, who also makes a distinction between the leader and the manager, and amplifying the importance of the manager as coach, as really understanding that sort of direct relationship with their players or their people, to understand the specific qualities that they bring, and then that kind of close attention to build up that capability to deliver that specific piece of work in that sort of rounded way. But often what we often see is you get technically great people who performed really well as a player, so to speak, or as a member of the team, moved into the manager role, which is a completely different role. And again, that's where organizational design comes in, because if my job when I tend to go into organizations is really delineating between the role of the team member, the role of the manager, the role of the leader, and understanding where are the boundaries between them, where there's opportunities to delegate or develop, but also recognizing where there's a real difference. If you want to maybe develop your technical expertise in an area and you don't have people skills, then please don't go into line management, because line management is people skills. You have to care about people, developing people and capability and confidence, understanding that sort of anxiety, being able to hold that together. And that's very different to people who want to do a really good job and have maybe a deep level of technical expertise in an area. So trying to design systems that reward people who want to get really kind of deep level layers of knowledge, and not just forcing everybody up this sort of the proverbial career ladder where the only next step is to become a manager, or that's the way to whatever this top is. I like to get rid of the top. Just get rid of it and draw it as a circle or do something, because some people's skill set does not lend them well to moving into management positions, but they're absolutely born to be a subject matter expertise. So that sort of, there's something in that, I think, that what you were saying in terms of the trust you place in your team members and that coaching thing, that I think translates really well into just an organizational setting where a manager kind of equates to a coach for me. And then a leader is probably like the manager in terms of the sporting kind of stuff, in terms of we got to make sure we've got the money for the players, make sure that strategically we're giving you top cover, all those sorts of things. So I think there's definitely some read acrosses between sports and then OD for sure.
I'm just fascinated because I've known Bex for a little while now, and I've not heard this before, and I think it's really insightful. Well, I'm sitting here listening and I'm thinking, oh, wow. I'm looking at myself. I'm trying to be self-aware and reflective. I think, well, where would I fit into this scheme? And I come away with two questions. And one is, can many people be both managers and leaders? And to what extent is self-awareness about what leadership and management means important? Because if you're going to delegate the bits that you're not terribly good at, you've got to understand them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a great question. So the first one, can you be a manager and a leader? Like, are they mutually exclusive, perhaps, as concepts? I think there's something about the different hats you wear and the need to, what does the situation require of you? So I think the self-awareness aspect of this is really, really important, because you have to kind of recognize what your internal capabilities are. Like, where can you bring something of value to a scenario? Not just showing up because you're the leader, but where do I actually add value? And when should I just shut up and actually make space for other people? Because I would say that sometimes that is a problem in the leadership space. We may call it the elephant in the room, or the hippo, highest paid person's opinion. There is something about the wisdom that I think is inherent when you have some really great levels of self-awareness that allows you to know when to speak and when not to speak. And I think it's often more important when you're a leader to know when to shush than it is to have wonderful, wise words to say. But then there's also that space in terms of, like, what does the scenario require of you? So depending on what you're dealing with, if something is on fire and it's that sort of urgent kind of crisis situation, then you being shush in the background probably isn't a problem. That direct leadership that is controlling and putting things in place and has that sort of closer control space is probably really important in that space. When things are running really well, a different type of leadership is required. And it's kind of stepping out of the space and allowing the people who are closest to the work to really manage it, get to grips with it, being able to maybe be a little bit more creative. And so I think talking my way around it, I think there is a space for the hybrid leader stroke manager, but I don't think you wear the hat at the same time. And so there has to be a high degree of recognizing the scenario and what it requires of you that then beckons forth the right part of you to show up in that scenario. But I don't think we teach that. So in terms of kind of conventional leadership programs that I've been part of or participated in, I don't know that it's so well articulated, like how multifaceted you have to be in that leadership space, and how to navigate like wearing different hats so quickly. Because I think sometimes leadership is a bit airy and floaty. It's a bit nebulous. But then sometimes management also neglects really important things like process improvement and, the basics of measures and some of those things. So sometimes there's a real like heavy focus sometimes on like people or rules, but then it neglects some of like operational excellence type things. So I haven't yet seen like a sort of program that kind of helps people think about how those pieces are put together. And I suppose I'm just crafting it together from my own kind of tapestry of how I've been able to be exposed to some really cool things, which I think puts me in an okay place to be able to support other people, because you've got some service excellence. I really understand customer focus. I absolutely love operational excellence and process improvement and continuous improvement. So there's some foundational pieces to understand how systems work and how to measure things. And then you overlay that with the sort of psychology of behaviors of people, which I find fascinating. And I think there's certain aspects within that create a really good hybrid but I don't know that I'm not thinking that I'm I am very unique, obviously, but I don't think my experiences are unique. But I don't think it's often packaged that way when people go on their management program or their leadership program. There tends to be something missing that kind of neglects either the operational side or neglects the people side. So they tend to be two separate fields. And I think a blend of those would work really nicely to create that manager-leader hybrid.
I think that's a really great response, because it's made me think. I've been scribbling notes. I always scribble notes when I'm listening to somebody, and I'm looking at a little phrase you used earlier: purpose, measures, methods. I think you could apply that to leadership, because leadership has a purpose. I think we probably could be able to talk about that. There are measures. We know what we expect from leadership. I think it falls down with method, because I think most of the leadership programs I've ever been involved with are very prescriptive. This is what employee engagement is. It's about communication. It's about sharing information. It's about having meetings. It can't be that prescriptive. It's got to have other elements. And I think we're beginning to see some of those other elements. You mentioned trust earlier. Mm-hmm. Until 5 years ago, I can't remember trust being mentioned as an aspect of leadership, except in passing. And now we're beginning to talk about it as being a bigger factor.